I would also briefly like to introduce everyone on the panel with our audience. Madhu Mehra, she is a feminist lawyer and executive director of Partners for Law and Development that is also hosting jointly the evening today. Sumit Pawar, he is the founder of the QNet, Splash Events, and Queer Kala that aim at bringing together individuals across sexual and gender identities through creativity and art. Harnidh Kaur, she is a policy analyst, poet, columnist, and author. Quite a combination. Micky Bhatia, she is a psychoanalyst and a member of PTRC, which stands for Psychoanalytic Therapy and Research Center, as well as the International Psychoanalytic Association. She's a member at both the organizations. Paromita Vohra, she's a documentary filmmaker and screenwriter whose films explore issues of politics, feminism, culture, and desire. She's also the creative director of Agents of Ishq. And our moderator for the panel is Bishakha Datta, who's the executive director at Point of View. She's also a non-fiction writer and filmmaker. So welcome, and we can now begin.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. So why don't we just give everybody time to settle down, right? Yeah. If there's anybody else coming in, yeah, we are done? Okay, then great. Let's go ahead. So first of all, thank you very much, Madhu and Partners in Law and Development, for partnering with us on this, because it's clearly a vital conversation that we need to have. And thank you for making these videos, which are really concise and yet really show us that the fault lines of consent, right? Which is what the topic of our first discussion is going to be. So what I actually wanted to begin with was by telling all our panelists, as well as everybody who's here, that we really want to have a conversation where we speak freely and fearlessly, where we are really able to say what is on our minds respectfully, even if that means that we have to push and challenge each other a little bit on our views, even if that means that we are not 100% in agreement. What we really want to talk about is the fault lines of consent. So I would really love it if people didn't feel constrained, but really found a way to express what is on their minds, and that goes for both panelists as well as the audience that is part of this. So with that, I want to actually begin by asking all the panelists to react to the videos that we just saw, right? We showed 4 of the videos called Unboxing Consent. And when you were seeing them, what is it that it brought up for you? What did it sort of, how did you react to it? What were the thoughts that went through your head? So, anybody?
Yes. So, thank you everybody thank you Bishakha and organizers for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation. So, I was watching the videos right now, and I was watching it a little earlier also and wondering how I was going to take this forward. And I just wanted to say that that tune at the end of each video kind of left me feeling helplessly out of control. It was like I had no clue what was going to happen next. What was he going to do? What was she going to do? What question was going to be asked? Which brings me to the question how out of control we all actually are. But we all need to behave today in forums and social media, at our workplaces, in our relationships, like we are all totally in control and have to hide every bit of helplessness possible. So that's what I wanted to start with. One more thing is that I was also watching these videos, and I wanted to talk about the difference between listening and hearing. And I'm sure you'll all know the Wikipedia definition of listening and hearing, but I think it strikes me all the time as to how much we hear and how much we listen. And I'm struck when I'm actually listening to a violinist play, that if if you see the way a violinist holds the violin, he's listening to every beat, every strum, every string that's playing. And I think when people feel listened to, I think it's the most joyous experience. And when people don't feel listened to and they just feel heard, like we do all the time because we have such heavy agendas, all of us to follow, I think it's not a wholesome experience. It doesn't allow us to feel contained. It doesn't allow us to feel held. It doesn't allow us to feel heard. And I just want to reflect on listening and being heard through this whole dialogue on consent and rejection.
Thank you so much, Micky, also for reminding us that listening is the first step to understanding, right? And I think one of the things that the videos does brilliantly is, again, we listen to these experiences. We listen to these day-to-day practices and experiences of giving consent, not giving consent, whatever, right? Fellow panelists. Yeah.
I mean, Micky's comments were beautiful, actually. And I also felt, I mean, while listening to these stories, that consent is in such danger of becoming a buzzword and losing all its meaning in some senses. It's a powerful kind of idea that has grown in the last 5 years as a way of talking about all the difficulties of gender, all the inequities in workspaces and relationships and the violence that surrounds us. But I fear that it very quickly lends itself to becoming a stick to beat ourselves and other people up with if we are not really thinking about the larger frame of relationships and our larger attitudes to sex, attraction, love, etc. And I think that very often I would feel listening to the stories that there is this feeling like, how dare somebody be attracted to me? And there is, I know that we speak a lot as feminists especially, and I've done lots of work on consent myself, so we talk a lot about affirmative consent, but we know that the truth of relationships is that so much happens in the unsaid spaces, and the moment we stop privileging the unsaid space, we're in danger of going into a fascist kind of, a grid, which is not how human beings live. So I think it's kind of important that when talking about consent to maybe reframe how we talk about it and locate it within the complexity of relationships and within the complexity of what kind of attitudes to sex, love, and gender we bring into every context. I'd love to say that in the workspace we should keep the personal and the professional separate, and it's always a struggle to try to understand how to do that, but it's also human that there are lapses and there are misunderstandings. So how does one actually raise a discussion about consent which is empathetic to mishearing or misapprehending something and not immediately rush to penalize the misunderstanding, at least in our discourse? Law is a completely different kettle of fish, but in our way of responding to something. So yeah.
Okay. Harnidh, Sumit, would either of you like to?
Very honestly, a sickening sense of familiarity. When you interact with a lot of... I have a lot of fellow young people entering my DMs, emails, mentions. They tag me, and these are conversations that are happening very slowly, but people don't actually know how to have these conversations. They're struggling to find language. They're struggling to find words to describe what they're feeling, the sense of discomfort or the sense of, I like this person, how do I tell her without it being complicated? And when I see these videos, what I see is a larger trend, to echo Paro, that the lexicon of consent is so limiting. Okay, quick show of hands. How many of you went to colleges? Fair. How many of you feel you're fairly woke? Fairly woke, fairly aware, your bits and pieces about gender, etc., etc. How many of you would also pause when asked what consent means? I know I would, very happily. Now imagine we, with our privilege of knowing this language and of shaping this language, still falter. How do you make this language accessible to a 16-year-old girl, to someone who's not speaking the same language as you, to someone who's from a different context. We sit in these privileged spaces and we look at these videos and say, oh, so sad. But we don't actually talk about how even we haven't had a conversation about how to have this conversation. So, just a, again, kind of feeling with these videos.
Thank you.
So also, rightly said that how many people will going to talk about the consent. I believe that when this is going to introduce, when I was 16 or I was in college, I don't think so. I have know about there's something called consent, and I think so there's something about there's a love where we have to go and ask someone that, okay, will you have sex with me or no, or will you going to date me? So I believe right now the generation, when young perspective, that we live in a fast food life. We all wanted to live relations are more of 24 hours, 1 day, 1 week, and I believe in that sense of time, who asks consent? Everyone is so fast forward, no one asks that. Everyone think that, okay, I'm boy or I'm coming from the privilege and I look good, so that's why she will be saying yes or no. So she has to say yes, or either way in a girl's side, like he has to say yes. So I think so that's the life right now we are living, and somewhere down the line we really need to set somewhere some, not rule I will say, because young generation doesn't understand rules, because they always say that rules are for breaking. So I don't think so there has to be a rule, but I think so there has to be some language which it's just layman language, I will say. I will also, again, the privilege is more about your language, what kind of a cloth you wear, what kind of where you go. And where we talk about, there's a lot of young generation which comes from a background where English videos, these are not there. There's no such material which talks about consent. I don't think so. What is a meaning consent? A sehmati, which is, I don't know, if I go and say, kabhi aapne sehmati kisi se मांगी, and he will be like, what? So the language, हमारे पास कोई एक ऐसी भाषा नहीं है जिससे हम बात कर सके, तो वो develop करनी या वो किसी से सिखानी, that is more important. So that's.
Sumit, I'm going to share the mic with you. Yeah. No, but thank you actually for reminding us that consent in many senses is a hard word. And it's a political word. It's not like our everyday sort of thing, right? And putting it into practice, conceptually, etc., is sort of complicated. But before we go forward, actually, I want to ask Madhu. Madhu, you are partners in law and development, actually, from what I know, has done far more work on sort of legal aspects, right? And this is perhaps one of the first times that you all are making such a big video series. There's many that we haven't seen yet. So I'm very curious about what prompted PLD to actually go ahead with this video series and how you all came to it.
So in 2013, when the sexual harassment at workplace law was enacted, and in 2013 also the criminal law amendment, which is called the anti-rape laws, came into being, we sort of went headlong into doing trainings, especially government officials as well as people who are sitting in this internal committees, and we were called to colleges, universities, private sector. And today there's just a lot of young people out there in colleges, coaching centers, in BPOs, private sector, and the kinds of questions that were coming to us, or the cases that were being shared with us, were very different from the cases that make headline news, which are the high-profile predatory kind of cases, the Weinstein type. Here were young people to whom no other information was available, except now there was a law and they were at the brink of being punished. And we were saying, enforce the law. Well, here's the law. We are equipping you and begin to enforce the law. And the way to enforce it was dominated by entirely a legal imagination and the kind of approach used for predatory cases. And at that time, when we had, we were documenting these cases, and as we went along, we were really troubled by this kind of approach where we were giving to young people almost nothing to validate sexual curiosity, attraction, desire, or simple tools that would help them navigate these terrains, whether they were in college or they were at the workplace. And workplaces where a large number of people find their mates. So, all we are saying is, here are the boundaries, you stand to be punished, be careful. And so we felt that medium was really inept. And at that time, we were processing this and we said, well, why don't we make these videos, which only as a postscript we talk about the law, but essentially we approach it in a very non-judgmental way. There are no villains here. There are no perpetrators and victims. There are people who are both in the midst of something which could gravitate to greater or lesser intimacy, but they're reading things differently and something goes wrong. So we wanted to allow a sort of non-threatening medium, such as a video, to tell these stories, and through the stories prize out issues of boundary, issues of verbalizing, knowing that verbalizing is actually not going to be a solution at the end of it. But nonetheless, I also want to flag our extreme difficulty in 2013 and 2012 when the law was changed to make the sexual consent, age of sexual consent, higher. It was 16 years earlier, it's 18 years now. The state has also rejected comprehensive sexuality education as an elementary part of education. So the young children and youth have literally no inputs on sexuality. And when they turn 18, they suddenly, this entire responsibility of perfect conduct is thrust upon them with the fear of very serious punishments. I think that's unconscionable, really, which is why we sort of took this route to talk about it in a different way.
Thanks a lot, Madhu. Micky, you would like to say something? Yeah.
So in developing this language, I just wanted to say one thing, that we saw all these people on screen and all this amazing work that's being done. But I wanted to open up the discussion a little bit about the fact that there is a conscious part of us, and we are operating and we are reading books and we are listening to dialogues and stuff like that. But there's an unconscious part of us which sometimes remains, I think all the time, remains completely at the back burner. And I think it doesn't come up, and I think it'll be very helpful if we are able to bring it up a little bit in our conversation today, so that we can look at things a lot more subjectively and not just there, because with each conversation, so much has happened before and so much is to happen, and I really think the unconscious will play a huge role. So there's not only an external reality that's there for all of us, but there's an internal reality. There's a particular set of feelings with which I'm sitting here, hoping to address all of you all and start this conversation. So there's something going on all the time. And if there can be a little integration between what goes on behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, maybe we'll be a little better off.
So Micky, can we, since you've brought up the topic, and I totally agree that, and I saw a lot of people were sort of nodding their heads, that there's a part of ourselves, our behavior, whatever, which is conscious, and a part of it that isn't. Could you perhaps talk a little more about it, or perhaps give us some examples in terms of how might we understand consent if we were to bring in the unconscious? Or what would change in the way we think about it? But we can come back to that, right?
Whatever you want.
What, if you're ready to, please.
Okay, ask me the question one more time.
Which is that, just following up on what you were saying, right? That let's not have, let's take the conversation to understanding that there's a huge part of our psyches, whatever, which is unconscious, which also governs our behavior, who we are, etc. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I agree completely. And that if we were to try and understand consent using the lens not just of the conscious, but also of the unconscious, what would shift in our thinking, or what would, can you say a little more about it? Because I'm just trying to tie it to this conversation, that's all.
So, if we were to use our unconscious a little more, I think what happens, as I read somewhere, that is it the yang of rejection. And actually when we consent or sometimes acquiesce and think it's consent, what are we actually opening the door to? Actually we're saying, I'm available for discussion. I'm allowing you to come in, so to speak. And I think you're laying yourself open. And sometimes we may not be boundaried enough, or we may not know even what we are laying ourselves open to. Because sometimes when a feeling comes from the other side, you're acting at the spur of the moment, but you're also acting with your past knowledge. I mean, it's taken me years of training to withhold my past knowledge when I'm talking to a patient. Otherwise, we are taught to be reactive. We are taught to have an action and have a reaction to it. So you're expecting, or your patient is expecting, or people are expecting that you're going to have a reaction to it. And then it takes on a completely different turn. So, I mean, the real reason that you consented because you like someone or love someone or are attracted to somebody can completely fall apart, and mental spaces either grow or collapse. So my feeling is that if you allow subjective experience to reign and not probe, but I think inquire in a way to make the person feel heard or listened to, I think it opens up the mental space. And for me, that's what keeps me rooted to what I do, because the way it opens it up is actually fascinating.
Well, thank you. I think you're sort of building on your earlier point, which is about listening, but now saying let's listen to the subconscious as well. And from that, actually, Harnidh, I wanted to move to you, because you were also talking about the difficulties of the lexicon, the absence of a lexicon, the absence of language, the difficulty of having a conversation around this, right? And again, I know we are Facebook friends. I know that these are conversations that you have quite a lot, right? Both online and perhaps offline. So I think it would be great if you could share a little about, why do you think it's so hard for us to actually have a conversation about consent, right? And, what is that gray area? Why is it so difficult to navigate?
There's this concept which I came across recently. It's called crisis feminism, in which we take words out of context. We don't actually build on their backgrounds, and we arm young women especially with them. And we say, go into the world, brandish these will protect you. Consent becomes a word like that. Yes means yes, no means no becomes a word like that. Male gaze is a trending phrase or so. What happens is that you don't contextualize these phrases, these words, these concepts. So what you have is people, hurt, vulnerable people holding these really sharp-edged words without actually knowing how to utilize them, which is a major cause of why a conversation on consent cannot occur. A conversation on consent can occur only when you create a space for it. You cannot expect, अगर आपको बात करनी होती है, बात करने का तरीका होता है. अगर दुनिया में वो तरीका ही नहीं इस्तेमाल होगा तो आप किससे बात करोगे, कैसे बात करोगे, right? So that is one portion. Second is simply the overwhelming lack of conversation on consent. जब आपने वो वीडियो बनाई Agents of Ishq की, that played, that was great, but when an Akshay Kumar in Toilet Ek Prem Katha stands on a tree and stalks a woman who won't marry him because he doesn't have a toilet, by simple volume of shares and views and reach, consent is not something we talk about. Consent is not something we build a world for. So before, again, like I said, हमें words पता हैं, loves हमारे पास हैं, लेकिन unless we break down where they come from, unless we break down why we need them, unless we break down why it is necessary for us to understand those words, they exist in a vacuum. We don't live in a vacuum. conversations on consent are fairly impossible in a world which is geared towards the utter lack of it. As simple as that. So I think that is where we start. We start by fostering safe spaces, which I do on Twitter. You must have seen, tell me about your experiences. Let's talk about this. What I have seen is that the moment you tell someone, I don't judge or I don't react, I let you speak, they will open up. But how many of us allow the other person the courtesy of doing so? Even in our personal capacities, let alone in the ecosystems we build, how many of us are so quick to shut down someone? So am I, of course. But, nobody is perfect. But if I've learned anything, it's that conversations build ecosystems that build change. You cannot just start from change and expect it to spread like a virus. It's not one, unfortunately. But yeah, that's what you begin with.
Okay, so let me actually again follow up on that and maybe ask Paro a question, but please, other panelists should also feel free to come into it. So for instance, Harnidh, you talked about the whole sort of feminist dictum, right? The classic, which is yes means yes, no means no. And Paro, in the Consent Lavani film that you made last year, which was lovely, and I think lots and lots of people online and offline have seen it. One of the concepts that you introduced is actually maybe. So could you talk a little about the maybe space of consent and what it means? Because that's again a fault line, right? Where we're going grey from the black and white.
I mean, I have to say that since making Consent Lavani, I also feel like, already I've moved ahead on thinking about the maybe. And maybe the task of, yes, so the task of feminism in some ways is to not get into that fixity, right? And the task of art is also not to remain in that fixity. So I think one of the things is that this idea of consent, and we've all spoken about how it's like weaponized in a way, rather than something that's an enabler or a prism through which to think about life and relationships. I think that both feminism and art, which are intertwined for me, are a way of understanding these things in a more emotive, unspoken way. Whatever is in the unspoken space, to think about that a lot more. And I also think that one should try to provide some kind of an antidote to that space which gets stuck and feels rigid, right? That like a maybe, the idea of putting the maybe into the Consent Lavani, which was that, yes, why did you say, I said yes to him for this much, not more. I said no, but actually I meant yes. And then I said maybe, and then he said, okay, I'll wait. So actually all three were maybes of some kind, right? And the maybe was just a linchpin of when somebody puts their hand on your knee, as in that story, and then you held their hand and they didn't remove their hand, that for me is a maybe. So if you went on to kiss them, I don't think you did a horrible thing, actually. So to be treated like you did a horrible thing is a sudden hardening of that which actually you took consent bit by bit. It's not like you leapt on them, right? So I think like with Consent Lavani, we wanted to open up that space that there is a maybe when we are trying to figure out how much we want, what we want, do we like, are we going to change our minds? Because we all know that thing, you really like somebody and then suddenly you don't like them and then you like them again. So you're also working out some shit in your head, basically, right? But over time, I also think that maybe even the maybe wasn't enough, right? So the new video that we made, actually I'm also trying to say that maybe the lexicon is important and words have to be renewed and their meanings have to be reinvigorated, and sometimes new words also have to be introduced to broaden the idea, and that consent should always be located maybe in the concept of choice. So the idea of the marzi hai minimum, which we do in the new video, is really to say that as long as we don't think about the fact that we choose things, our choices are determined by a lot of things, other people have the right to make choices, well, maybe it's impossible to really talk about consent. Like, it has to be a starting point, whereas it becomes a kind of finishing goal. And, then it becomes a way of judging, like, did you pass or did you fail in the woke exam, so to speak, right? But I also just wanted to also respond to the idea that, we can't combat Akshay Kumar's simplistic misogynies, no? And I don't actually believe that at all, because then I would have gone to sleep long ago and stopped doing any work, or at least got a really well-paid job somewhere, right? Instead of but I just think that yes, this is where the new thing happens, and Akshay Kumar will be singing a different tune year after next because of the speed of modern life, as Sumit pointed out, because we said something different, we made something different. So I believe that you have to have a strong sense of arrogance about your right to the culture and a belief that you will put out something new. And on Agents of Ishq, one of the things that I've seen, I'll end fast, but it's all about what question you ask, right? Because Agents of Ishq doesn't ask any hard-edged questions, and it doesn't ask you what your political affiliations are. It only approaches everything from a place where love, sex, and desire are not separated. It's an inclusive frame. It's only about your experience, really. Nobody's allowed to talk about other people's experiences unless they spend 25 years researching something. Otherwise, people, because that's all the stuff we get, right? I joined Grindr, which is only for losers. And then we always have to re-edit it to say, I joined Grindr and I felt like a loser. You can say that, but don't call other people losers, right? So, I mean, that is creating a new language. It's a language which says it's okay if you felt like a loser. We're not telling you everybody has to be like, something that Madhuri Dixit serial commercial that you get up in the morning, you start exercising and you're always confident. You can feel like a loser, just don't decide what other people feel. But as soon as you start asking people about their experiences, and you do it in a loving way, and you use art to dignify that experience, I don't think that I am finding everybody like Akshay Kumar in toilet. I feel that there are many, many other kinds of experiences about consent and what we'll come to later, rejection, about making mistakes, having done the wrong thing in response to another person's mistake, and a willingness to discuss that if we just ask a different set of questions. So really our task becomes, in a way, to keep reframing the question and not to stick with one question, perhaps.
Okay. Sumit, I actually want to ask you a question, but I want you to read the question and confirm that it's okay, because I'd sent it to you by email, and Yeah, you're sure? Yeah. Okay. So one of the things is, when we talk about consent, we usually talk about it in a gender context, and the assumption is that there's one man and there's one woman, or there's one boy and there's one girl. And Sumit, what I wanted to ask you is, how does consent play out in a situation where, say, two men are involved, right? Does that make any sort of difference? Is it the same? What could you tell us about that?
Okay. So basically, हमारे बीच में हम जहाँ पर रहते हैं, जिस हिसाब से जिस माहौल में रहते हैं या जिस देश में रहते हैं, वहाँ पर दो मर्दों के बीच में या दो औरतों के बीच में प्यार हो जाना अभी भी बहुत दूर की बात है. हम बड़े एक मेट्रोपॉलिटन सिटी बॉम्बे जैसे सिटी में रहते हैं, बट स्टिल इट इज़ अगेन वेरी डिफ़िकल्ट situation where two men or two women, I will not say gay, lesbian, bisexual, we talk about, let's talk about humans. So इन दोनों के बीच में consent वो बहुत दूर की बात हो जाती है. हम एक ऐसे समाज में रहते हैं जहाँ पर ये जो हम बैकग्राउंड जैसे देख रहे हैं, बहुत प्रिविलेज है. हमारे जो समाज है वो बॉलीवुड सीरियल्स और हमारी जो रामायण महाभारत है उसमें से ही कंसेंट वगैरह समझती है. मतलब वो जो उसमें बहुत बहुत अभी एक बार मैं गाना सुन रहा था कि गाना पिक्चराइज किया था, ना का मतलब हाँ होता है, अगर वो ना बोली तो मैं उसे प्यार कैसे करूँ. तो ये दिमाग में बहुत भरा हुआ है. और उसके बाद मस्क्यूलिनिटी, कितने माचो दिखते हैं आप, कितने आप हीरो टाइप दिखते हैं. और दो मेन के बीच में तो ये बहुत ज़्यादा आ जाता है. पहली बात तो हमारे पास स्पेसेस नहीं है. अगर हमें एक्सप्रेस करना है तो हमारे पास ऐसे कोई स्पेसेस नहीं है. एक्सेप्टेंस नहीं है. बहुत डिस्क्रिमिनेशन बहुत ज़्यादा हो जाता है. स्पेसिफिक जब अगर यंग जनरेशन की बात करूँगा मैं, तो हमारे पास ऐसे स्पेसेस नहीं है. दूसरी बात है, हमारे ऊपर ये कॉलेज लाइफ है तो हमारे ऊपर ये थोपे जाते हैं कि आप वैलेंटाइन डे है तो आपकी कोई गर्लफ्रेंड होनी चाहिए, आपको कोई एक गर्लफ्रेंड दिखानी है उस टाइम पर. मतलब मेरे पास जब मैं कॉलेज में था तब तो मेरे पास पिछले 7 सालों में मुझे ऐसा लगता था, वो हर 7 साल में जब भी वैलेंटाइन डे आता था मुझे ऐसा दिखना पड़ता था कि अब किसे बताऊँ मैं अपनी गर्लफ्रेंड, इसे बताऊँ या फिर कल मैं उसे बताऊँ कि कल रात को मैं यहाँ पर गया था और ये गिफ्ट मिला. इट्स फॉर मी इट इज़ वेरी स्ट्रेसफुल. अगर आपको किसी को लगता होगा कि यार क्या है, मतलब मजाक है, मतलब ये मजाक नहीं है. जब मैं था तब मुझे पता था कितना स्ट्रेसफुल हो जाता है कि एक कहानी बनाना, आप डायरेक्टर नहीं हैं, आप राइटर नहीं है, फिर भी आपको एक कहानी बनानी है, उस कहानी के किरदार बनाकर बताना है कि ये लड़की के साथ जाना. तो ये मैं इसके लिए बोल रहा हूँ, कंसेंट में आऊँगा क्योंकि ये इसके लिए बता रहा हूँ कि डिफ़िकल्ट इतनी हो जाती है कि कंसेंट वहाँ पर कहीं पर छुप जाता है. कंसेंट कहीं पर भी बात ही नहीं हो पाती कि आप इतने सारे स्ट्रगल करने के बाद जब आप बाहर आते हो, तो जब कोई मिलता है आपको कि चलो यार सेक्स करते हैं, तो अब कंसेंट आपका वहाँ पर ना के बराबर हो जाता है, बिकॉज आपके पास इतने प्रॉब्लम्स है, आप वो सॉल्व करेंगे कि आप वो जो एक नया कॉन्सेप्ट अभी कंसेंट करके लोग कह रहे हैं कि सहमति है या नहीं, तो वो बहुत छोटा हो जाता है जब दो मैन के बारे में बात होती है. जब वेब एप्लीकेशंस वगैरह जो है, बहुत सारे ऐप्स है जहाँ पर सेक्स डेट्स वगैरह की एप्लीकेशंस है, वहाँ पर बहुत आपके पास तो एक रिजेक्शन सबसे बड़ी बात हो जाती है. वहाँ पर रिजेक्शन आपके प्रोफाइल पिक्चर से शुरू हो जाता है. आपका फेसबुक प्रोफाइल पिक्चर कैसा दिखता है, उससे आपको फ्रेंड रिक्वेस्ट मिलती है. आपके टिंडर या फिर ग्राइंडर पर आपका फेस पिक्चर कैसा, उससे आपको मिलती है. आप कहाँ से है, आप चर्च गेट मरीन लाइन से है, पेडेट रोड से है, या फिर आप नाला सोपारा या भाईंदर के कहीं पर हो, वहाँ से हमारा ये सारा शुरू होता है. तो कंसेंट हमें वेरी रेयरली कंसेंट के बारे में कहीं बात होती है, जो मिला है उस पर काम चलाना पड़ता है, ऐसी वाली बात है.
Thank you, Sumit. Micky, you wanted to say something?
In talking about how we frame questions and what questions do we ask, I was also struck by this question that did you ask? And I was wondering whether we could also think about the dyad when we ask questions, that there's actually a relationship at play over there. And as much as did you ask, did the other person tell? So what was coming from either side? And only if we have a to and a fro, and I think you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is, where do we put the onus in our heads,
Exactly.
right? Is it on the asking? Is it on the telling? Or should it be like a shifting kind of, or
It's a constantly
slightly,
moving space,
fluid
yeah.
kind of thing? Okay, on that note, actually, thank you again also, Sumit, for really pointing out how in a community that is stigmatized, I mean, that consent almost becomes like, it's so far in a sense that it's almost like a luxury, because I think we in the women's rights movement take it as such a sort of, you know, core thing that we assume it sort of universally applies, right? So on that note, one of the things we wanted to do before we open it up to the floor is we had asked a couple of people to very briefly talk about consent from their perspectives. And I'm going to invite them now to just sort of stand up and speak from where they are. So the first person I'd like to invite is actually Tara Kaushal, who's the author of a forthcoming book called Why Indian Men Rape. And Tara, consent is clearly a critical aspect of your book, right?
Absolutely.
So if you could just, you know, in 2 or 3 minutes, just sort of give us your take.
Well, Bishakha, I think that central to the idea of consent is the fact that we're living in the middle of a massive cultural clash, right? On the one hand, women, we have arranged marriages, we have child marriages, we have that whole aspect, which is why we're not criminalizing marital rape, right? But on the other side, we have women who want to say no, who think they have the right to say no, and we totally do. We have rights over our own bodies, we have rights over we have agency. But when you put these disparate cultures together, you have a huge difference in expectation from each other, from the relationships that you're entering. And this becomes really difficult because when I was undercover, I met this gentleman who he and his gang would go around raping women that they found with their boyfriends in private places. And I asked him, I said, why do you think rape happens? And he says, there is no such thing as rape. Women always want sex. If they've had sex with one person, they're always interested in sex with other people. So there is no such thing as rape. Now, to me, this was really alarming because it completely discounts all the nuances of our emotions, all the nuances of interpersonal relationships, of power, of other dynamics, right? So I think at the base of all this is the fact that we don't know where we lie, where other people lie with regard to relationships, consent, saying yes. I mean, if we have child marriages, and honestly, the law doesn't help, because on the one hand you have you have issues of consent and marital rape, and we're talking about that. But on the other hand, you're also talking about women who can live with their boyfriends for years, and then if he changes his mind or if they have a fight, she can put him behind bars for, not marrying him as he said he would. So I think that when we talk about consent being nuanced, it is, and it's really, really personal, because we also have women who love, and I'm guilty of this too, when I was younger, but we love jealous boyfriends. We want jealous boyfriends. We did, right? Not anymore, but we did at some point. So where do we stand when it comes to this? And I think when we talk about the language of consent, it's really important that it is direct. And that to me is the foundation of it all, because there's too much guesstimation, right? Are you coming into this relationship wanting a jealous boyfriend? Are you your own agent? Are you expecting somebody to write Priya on his hand and, follow you around? Because that was what was considered romance at one point as well. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say about consent.
Well, thank you, Tara, for again opening it up by offering us another perspective. And the second person who we wanted to invite to do a lightning talk is actually my colleague Nikita, who before she joined Point of View was the executive director of HEAL, which worked on child sexual abuse. And she's going to talk a little about, I think, children and consent, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Bishakha. I was the co-director at HEAL. And I want to talk about children and consent a little bit. And I want to, I take everything that has been discussed by everyone at the panel and Tara so far. And I want to say that when it comes to children and consent, the discussions unfortunately get limited to the age of consent. So then we always, want to debate about what should be the minimum age of consent for a child, which basically implies that at what age is the society allowing them to willingly engage in sexual relations. But that's a very limiting conversation, because like Paro and others also reflected at the panel, that by the time you attain the age of consent, you are then expected to know exactly how you want to navigate relationships and assert consent and receive consent. But I want to, think and share my thoughts on what happens before the age of consent is achieved. And I want to share some examples with you. When I was at HEAL, which is an organization that works on child sexual abuse, we did a lot of prevention work. And as prevention work, we used to work with a lot of adult caregivers. And through my experiences of doing over 100 trainings, I found two things that for me bring out the gap, very profoundly. One is when you work with adult caregivers and you tell them, these workshops are like teaching them how to identify signs of child abuse and how to proactively, identify those signs and stop the situation or intervene at that level. When you talk about when you tell parents that, okay, you have to teach your children how to say no. And when they say no, you have to respect their no. And that is beyond just sexuality, that plays out in everyday routine life in a lot of different ways. Something as simple as if a child is being tickled and at one point the child wants it to stop, do you even listen to that child's no, And so there is this one point every time in the workshops that we would arrive at where the parents would be like, okay, but it is very difficult for us to teach children how to say no. So this should be the school's responsibility. Another thing they would find very difficult to fathom is when we would tell them that, okay, you have to also teach your children the correct names of their private body parts. And something as simple with like no sex or sexuality attached, just as a basic physiological lesson for children, would be something that parents would really and caregivers would really struggle with. Now, on the other hand, when we worked with children between the ages of 5 to 10, we ask them that, okay, have you ever been in situations where you felt like you want to reach out to someone for support or help? And they say yes, and then we also ask them that, is there anything that stops you from seeking help? And a lot of times children will say that, they fear being disbelieved. They fear, not being heard, or even if they are heard, like no action will be taken. They fear the stigma, or they fear the shame. They fear like people will call them out. And these are people in their own families, they're caregivers. So we also, have to look at the fact that there is, when we talk of culture of consent, there is a big gap when it comes to initiating children. And what kind of culture of consent are we initiating children into, which, of course, is very integrated with sexuality, but sometimes is also beyond that. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I think there are a couple of people on the panel who also want to say stuff, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So, Madhu, yeah.
Yeah, just two things. One is that, we've had discussions with fairly progressive people too as part of understanding consent. And what we realize is that in our intimate lives, as far as caregiving and housework goes, there is no concept of consent. There is a division of labor which is sort of expected to be carried out. So we don't really have a culture of negotiating these things in a very black and white way. That's one thing. And sexuality is an intimate part of our lives. The other is women culturally are discouraged to ever say yes. So we are going to find different ways of saying no to communicate even yes. And I think the first issue is that can we sort of even develop that culture where we negotiate, discuss, and choose to do what we want to do and we don't want to do, and seek pleasure on our terms. Until that is happening, I mean, even the definition of consent as it exists in law, it locates women as pleasure givers because they consent to a man. They don't sort of set the terms of what they might want. And I think this law sort of dominating the entire sphere of conversation just sort of closes in on many of the nuances which we really need to keep alive to transition to a more sort of greater awareness on this, self-awareness on this.
Would anybody else on the... Yeah.
One thing that strikes me again and again is how rigid our definitions of relationships are. In general, there is friendship, full stop. Love, full stop. Lust, full stop. There is never a point where you allow each other the lexicon of maybe shifting between these goalposts. And that's how relationships work, right? There might be a friend you think you like, then you realize, oh wait, no, I don't like him or like her. And even when you are younger, at least I remember it, that whatever I read, whatever pop culture I consumed, so much of what a relationship looked like, of what intimacy looked like, was governed by these really rigid definitions. And that actually limits what kind of consent you can give or take. Because if you don't have a language that allows me to say, I like you right now, but I like you only this amount. Maybe I will like you more later, maybe not. That exists. And anyone who tells you that doesn't exist didn't meet people probably. Because no, it's okay. How many of you kind of liked a friend and then didn't like him? Like all the time. I sometimes don't like my friends at all. So, again, there is place for softness and pleasure in human relationships. We are so eager to make them hard lines that cannot be, crossed or cannot be transgressed, that we forget that we are not very rational consumers of love and pleasure. We are fairly irrational when it comes to it. And if we don't actually engage with that as a concept, we are losing this, idea of a fairly egalitarian society. So that even when you're children, you need to be told that there are feelings and it's okay to have them. So,
Micky, yeah, go ahead. You have a mic. Yeah.
Harnidh, just in response to what you're saying, love, full stop, friendship, full stop. I think what ends up happening is that, unfortunately, maybe it's in all societies, but liking, attracting always gets sexualized. I mean, I don't know why we just can't like someone. And I also don't know why we can't like someone and also dislike certain parts about them. And why both of them can't coexist, as does happiness and sadness, as does envy and gratitude, as does joy and sorrow. It's only when we acknowledge the sorrow that we can become better human beings and love more deeply. So, just both of them existing. And I don't know if you want to talk about rejection now, or is that later?
A little later, yeah. So, Paro, yeah.
I just wanted to build on what Madhu said, actually, because Madhu's pointing out to the limits and limitations of the law as a language, as a conceptual framework, right? And the difficulty that we have in understanding that it's only one framework within which we operate, that we operate in multiple frameworks. But I do feel that sometimes when we are talking about, what we're going to equip people with, we don't seem to accept that life is the thing that helps us to learn things. I mean, we'll get an education and many things will happen, but eventually you only learn about life by living it. And you're going to make a lot of mistakes and you're going to be an ass. And I have been. Yeah, and you're not going to know your own mind and other people's and all of that. So I'm also wondering how we can factor that into the way we talk about all this, right? That there are going to be many mistakes, and sometimes we are bringing that legalistic understanding even to the way we are talking about relationships or equipping ourselves with knowledge, etc., etc.
I just wanted to say a couple of things before I open it up, and I can already see 2 hands up, 3. Okay, which is that I think what's interesting, first of all, is that I feel like the conversation about consent, which has always been a binary conversation, the yes and the no, is becoming a conversation about an arc of consent, right? And I want to say that I think that's an interesting concept, and it's a controversial concept, because embedded in the notion of accepting an arc of consent is that you're not going to have in every single case the hard yes or the hard no, right? Or even variations thereof. And I think in that context, I just want to share that I was at a workshop last week with about 25 women from all over the world. And one of the things they made us do was they asked all of us, do you have difficulties saying either yes or no, or maybe, right? And they sort of made us do a little exercise where we practiced it. But what was very interesting for me, and this was not in a sexual context, this is just like in life, is I think the vast majority of women, and they were, said that we really find it hard to say no. And that we are always trying to sort of politely skirt, and we are always trying to find a roundabout way of saying it. And, one woman said that if she directly says a no, that she sort of feels like a little feverish and she gets a bit of a flush, and that it's very, very difficult for her. And I want to offer this as something that we seriously need to reflect upon, perhaps not answer, but what does it mean when you, in your broader life, find it, you have been schooled and socialized so strongly to always adjust, to never say no. And what does that mean when we bring that back to the more smaller conversation around relationships and consent, right? So with that, I'm just going to open up to, okay, there's 1, 2, wait, and there was one more, 3. Okay.
Madam, see. Consent is made up of 3 things: approval, approval and conformism. What we are talking of consent is of conformism. It is society is teaching you to conform. And what signals do you send out? When you hang out, what do you share? Consent should bring caring inside. Mistakes there should be retakes. And what is happening is closeness, attention and shoulder to cry on is taken as vulnerability. And 3 questions I got. How do you decide when giving consent? What was it that made the other person misunderstand when you gave consent? What type of conversation you make when you give consent? And You spoke about subconscious. Subconscious is subjective conscious or subject conscious. That means you're hiding something and you're pushing it into your subconscious. And conscious is availability and unconscious is non-availability. So these are the three things. So consent is authority figures. We ask consent from authority figures, but we don't know how to take consent from other people. That we should deal with. Thank you.
Okay, let's take the next two questions and then we can ask the panel for responses. Yes. Yeah, but whatever you want to respond to. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. One of the things that I was thinking about in this entire conversation about young people and consent. So I find a lot of consent is tied up with self-worth as well, especially with young people. I mean, the kind of sexual adventures or misadventures I had in my 20s differ vastly from how I'm going about my life now. So many of the times I might have said yes simply because my self-worth at a time when I was young, when I was negotiating spaces and the idea of the self was wonky and wobbly. And so I didn't understand what consent really meant till I went along, and then I realized that I might have said yes to this situation because I'm not very sure of how I feel about myself and I want to be viewed in a certain way, especially as a young, sexually active woman. However, in my 30s, I find that I have a greater grasp on what I want to say, how I want to be perceived. So I think consent, especially with young people, is tied up in a lot of ways with self-worth.
Thank you. I think that's also a really important point. And then, yeah.
So with my personal experience with consent, where I've had trouble either saying yes, no, or maybe, has always been where there has been a major power imbalance with the person I am engaging with. And in that situation where there is the power imbalance, your yes, no, and maybe can have consequences in other avenues of your life, which is unrelated to the pleasure or sex or whatever you are trying to engage in with that person. So how does it, I've racked my head about it and it's been so difficult, but how do you navigate those kind of spaces where you have to deal with that power imbalance?
Okay, I know you had your hand up, so yeah, do you want next round? Okay.
So I'll just make the comment. So I thought that you made very interesting points, Paramita, especially the love, desire, sex, and that space. And I know we're talking about consent, but power, one thing, it would be very nice to address the power situation. And the other thing is taboo around love, lust, desire, sex. That is something that we really need to address. If two young people had sex, and if, of course, one, we need to talk about consent. And is consent being driven by taboo? Is a woman not consenting because she considers sex to be taboo? A woman, girl, whatever you want to, term that as. Taboo around monogamy, taboo around polygamy, taboo around sex out of marriage, taboo around sex at a particular age with a particular person, gender, all of these, the taboo really needs to be addressed, because I think a lot of problems will be solved if we address the taboo issue. I know we talked a lot about judgment, prejudice, all of that comes into play when we're talking about taboo.
Okay, so why don't we ask if any of the panelists would like to respond to anything or comment?
About power and engaging with power in the space of intimacy. Personally, I have a very strict rule that if I feel a power imbalance or overpowers intimacy in a situation, I will not engage with it, simply because I don't feel equipped enough to engage with it. It's a personal policy, and a lot of people might have problems with it. But speaking as a young person with not a lot of social capital vis-a-vis the people who do have social capital, I wonder if you can disengage hard-lined hierarchies and power from intimacy. For example, a professor and a student, like you must have been going through that entire case that's happening, that's splashed all over when a woman professor actually, it is alleged that she sexually harassed a male student. Can you take power out of the equation, especially when the person holds in their hand so much of what can happen to you in the immediate and later future? I don't know. And I think it's amoral for anyone with clear supervisionary power over you to engage in intimacy, and the discretion lies on them because they are in position of social capital. B, I look for answers too, because intimacy is political in many ways. You can't disengage with that. So how do you say that, yes, you are my professor or boss outside this room, but inside this room, those hierarchies don't matter? Your personal and political are very intimately intertwined. How do you disengage with them? I sometimes feel you simply can't. So.
You want?
Yeah, you go ahead. I'll talk.
Actually, I mean, I was just thinking actually what Sumit said in response to both the ideas of taboo, the power, and as well as self-worth. That this idea that you get rejected because of the way you look. So power is actually a complicated thing, and we are constantly talking about it in only one way. So what is the power of being a good-looking person, for example? There are all sorts of powers, and it's important that we talk about all of that to be really fair to ourselves and others. And I think in terms of the self, like I feel one thing that happens in the consent debate is not, it's just a thought which came up when you talked about self-worth, is that a lot of it is putting the onus on other people. This is what that person should do, this is what that person should do. And this must be discussed, of course, because we come with a history of never having talked about these things so openly as we are doing now. But I think there's a lot of questions that I feel, at this age now, I started living on my own when I was 22. Definitely one of the reasons for living alone was to want to explore all parts of life, including the sexual, on my own. So lots of confusions, lots of messes, and then you arrive at a certain point in life thinking that the really big question also was, what kind of person do I want to become? Not just, that is feminism's question for me, right? Like, what kind of woman do I want to become? I don't want to be the woman who's I'm told I should become. So it's an undefined thing, as much as what I want men to be like. And I feel we shouldn't lose track of that question, and we lose track of it a lot. And therefore we give up the opportunity to equip ourselves with whatever muscle, community, knowledge, other things that we need to be able to negotiate with power, right? Like, we are not accessing the power for ourselves because we're not thinking about ourselves as becoming powerful beings. We're often only thinking about how much power the other person has and how much power we don't. And we need to somehow examine that as well.
Also wanted to, when we are talking about two men, so for us right now, it's how it is. We are adopting everything as in how the heterosexual men and women used to do. So in homosexuality also, when there are two men, always we think about one will be as a guy and another one will be womankind. So the one person will be fulfill all the responsibility or roles. He will play the roles how the men play in the heterosexual, and the other person will be always he has to play the whatever the women play in the heterosexual. So it also, in that say, the power always goes with the person who is macho, who is in the in homosexual, who plays a role as a man. So it is also very difficult to there to talk about the consent, because you already are so much spaces where you have a very less time, you have a very less spaces. I don't think so anyone will be allowing any hotels or anywhere, wherever, or we talk of any gardens. There are times when people wanted to go and have a time together. I will say, I don't want to do anything else, but then two men sitting at a restaurant, or men, I don't think so. No one is allowing two men nowadays. In Bombay also, when we say that we are very developed, we are very forward, but then no one is allowing two men entering to any one restaurant. So I don't know that that consent is always in my hand, that it's secondary thing, or it is very least thing which I will think about right now. I'll think about that, how we are going to get the time together. So all this goes down, the whoever has a space, whoever plays, that is a powerful man in that whole game. So that's why there is no consent. There is always hierarchy. There is always a power which you're going to play.
Thank you very much again for talking about all the sort of different forms of power. What we're going to do now is, if you remember, the program is about both unboxing consent and handling rejection, right? And we're going to play 3 very short 2-minute videos on rejection.